Hello and welcome to On Second Street, where today we're talking about one of the top issues in the country, and I'm referring to the high cost of housing. This has become a major issue in Canada. In fact, a recent Ipsos poll found that 80% of people who are renting right now believe that home ownership has just become too costly. It's become something that's for the wealthy and not for them. So obviously this is a major concern, and we're seeing this issue right across the country. But today we're going to talk with a couple experts from Ontario who can really help us dive into this issue to figure out what exactly the problems are. Scott Andison is the CEO with the Ontario Home Builders Association, and Chris Spoke is a partner with the real estate development firm Toronto Standard. Thank you both for joining me today to talk about this issue. Scott, I mentioned off the top that this is not just an Ontario problem. I mean, everyone knows about it being a British Columbia problem as well, but it's really happening right across the country, isn't it?
It really is, Colin. We've got what I would call a perfect storm. We have governments who have not really paid attention to the importance of housing supply over, 2-3 decades. And then all of a sudden we have high interest rates that have come in relatively quickly across the country, making housing affordability just out of reach for so many Canadians.
Chris, you really focus on the Ontario scene, obviously, but could you just give us an idea of what's happening there in Ontario when it comes to people wanting to be able to buy homes but not being able to afford them?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a couple of things. The first thing we're seeing is rents have continued to rise over the last few years. There's this kind of disconnect between the rental market and the for sale market, where with rate hikes that we've seen over the last couple of years, we've seen some price moderation, which doesn't really speak to increased affordability because now the cost of debt, the cost of a mortgage has gone up. And one metric to keep our eyes on is what are rents doing. And rents have continued to rise despite the fact that we're seeing some softening in the for sale market. And again, the for sale market, despite the softening, the barriers still exist, because whereas you might have been able to get a 2 or 3% mortgage rate a couple of years ago, now you're probably up at 5 or 6%. So across the board, we're seeing fewer people that are able to buy, which means the renting and rents continue to rise.
So I want to get both of your perspectives on this. 30 years ago, this didn't seem to be the issue that it is today. So, Scott, we'll get your take first, but what has changed? Why are we looking at this problem now, whereas 30 years ago we weren't?
Yeah, I think part of it, when we look at population growth, you take, 1995, around there, 11 million in population across the country. Now we're looking at, Ontario, and then you were looking at, upwards of 15%, it's 35, 36%. Growth rate. Housing supply just has not kept pace with that. You also throw into, you've got a major shock into the system of the last several years around COVID. People realizing that their 500 or 600 square foot condo is just not conducive to two people doing Zoom calls all day, and they were looking for other alternative housing. So they went and found it. And to Chris's point, mortgage rates were much more favorable back 3-4 years ago. So they went into the housing market, and all of a sudden they've got a shock that's just not able to, that they're just not able to absorb.
And Chris, what about from your perspective? What do you think has really changed over the past 30 years that has contributed to this problem?
Yeah, I think a few things. So we work in property development, and a big part of this process before anything changes on site is the kind of municipal approvals process. And this certainly has gotten much more involved. It's a much more expensive and a much more time. It takes a lot more time to complete these days. 30 years ago, we had a lot more greenfield land that was available for kind of subdivision development, which generally happens much quicker and with less, for example, neighborhood pushback and that sort of thing. We've kind of built out all the greenfield land. Certainly in Toronto, we're butting up against the Greenbelt, which is kind of like an urban growth constraint. So we're dealing with infill development within cities, it's a lot more sensitive and frankly, a lot more political. So it might take us 3 years just to get from buying a site to being able to put a shovel in the ground. And that 30 years ago, that was probably more like 3 months.
When we come back, I want to ask you about what I think of as the 5 ingredients for housing. You need land, you need raw materials, to nails and drywall and those types of materials to actually build houses. You need labor to build them. You need government approvals, and obviously you need money. I want to ask the two of you when we come back what you see as sort of the bottlenecks what are the holdbacks with getting enough housing on the market for Canadian buyers? We'll be back with more right after the break.